On this Friday night, a Canadian detained in China is back home.
China is not trying to make things worse.
But with two Canadians still in custody, accused of violating national security, how should Canada interpret the release of one citizen?
I'm grateful for the lower prices.
For much of the country, filling up hasn't been this cheap in months, even years. So what's behind these sinking prices, and how long can it last? And Donald Trump threatens a new shutdown, the entire southern border.
The president wants to fix our broken immigration system.
How will those demands for a wall play out in 2019? Our U.S. political insiders are here with the storylines to watch next year. This is The National. They have been called pawns in a high-stakes diplomatic dispute between Ottawa and Beijing. Canadian citizens detained by China following the arrest here of a Huawei executive. But now, after more than a week in custody, Sarah McIver has been released. And tonight, she's back on Canadian soil after landing in Vancouver this morning. That's where Renee Filippone begins our coverage.
Sarah McIver was teaching English in China when she was taken into custody earlier this month. Beijing says it was about questions over her work permit that she was arrested and sentenced to administrative punishment. In a statement today, Global Affairs says it can confirm that a Canadian citizen who was detained in China this month has been released and has now returned to Canada.
It lowers the temperature in terms of public sentiment, right? Because we were not expecting her release that soon. So I think it is good for the public sentiment. But actually, the authorities on both sides, both Canadian authorities and Chinese authorities, have been saying that her case is unrelated to Huawei arrest.
Tensions between Canada and China have been growing since the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. She was taken into custody 4 weeks ago at the Vancouver airport at the request of the U.S. government. It wants her extradited, and the entire situation has been deeply political from the outset.
The Chinese fully expect and want to initiate a dialogue at the highest level if we are to use your word, de-escalate and try to normalize relations in the aftermath of this particular situation.
McIver is the third Canadian detained in China this month. Canadian businessman Michael Spavor and diplomat Michael Kovrig were arrested over serious accusations of breaching China's national security. Those two arrests are being viewed as retaliatory, but with McIver's case, it's unclear.
We are looking into the details on this most recent one that doesn't seem to fit the pattern set by the previous two.
There's actually no hard evidence to suggest that the Chinese authorities are treating Canadians in any unfair manner. But having said that, I would also urge Canadians already in China, whether you are studying, working or doing business in China, just to take a very low profile.
Okay, Renee, we know Sarah McIver back in Canada tonight. Have we heard anything, though, about how she's doing?
Well, Rosie, we know right now she's in Vancouver. Her aunt telling us tonight that her mother and sister, they're coming here to pick her up, and that everyone is thrilled that she is back home. So that's great news for one family. But remember, there are still two other Canadians detained in China, two other families worried about their well-being. And tonight we've had no indication that anything has changed in their cases.
Okay, Renee Filippone in Vancouver tonight. Thanks, Renee.
You're welcome.
Another Canadian detained in China could find out his fate tomorrow. This case dates back to 2014, so well before these current tensions. A Chinese court says Robert Lloyd Schellenberg will stand trial on drug smuggling charges. Canadian officials say they've been providing consular assistance in his case for years, but Chinese media suddenly brought the case to light again this week, and in an unusual move, inviting foreign journalists to attend the open court hearing tomorrow. China considers drug smuggling a serious offense with possibility of life imprisonment or even the death penalty. It's an impasse affecting 800,000 American civil servants and dozens of U.S. government agencies. And today it became very clear the partial shutdown of the U.S. government is indeed going to stretch into a second week, perhaps even beyond the new year. It's all because of Donald Trump's ongoing budget battle with Democrats over the funding for his border wall. And as Ron Charles reports today, the U.S. president issued a series of threats, raising the stakes even further.
The U.S. Capitol building sat nearly empty today after lawmakers adjourned for the weekend without a deal to end the government shutdown. Donald Trump's frustration boiled over again on Twitter. "We will be forced to close the southern border entirely," he wrote, "if the obstructionist Democrats do not give us money to finish the wall." Trump suggested the move would net the U.S. what he called a profit, saying it would bring car manufacturing back across the border from Mexico, taking the U.S. back to the days before NAFTA. Many lawmakers disagreed.
It stifle commerce, significant commerce between our two countries. It benefits both of us. And so I just don't think that he'll follow through. I hope not.
Trump also tweeted without offering evidence that a new caravan is forming in Honduras and repeated a threat to cut off all aid to that country, El Salvador, and Guatemala. The tweets were too much for some politicians.
This is all part of a total anti-immigrant screed that the president has been on for 2 years now. And as far as I'm concerned, it should stop, and I'm really glad that the House is now in Democratic hands so that we can have some checks and balances.
The administration is also dealing with the fallout from the deaths of 2 children of Guatemalan migrant families in U.S. custody. Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, visited the border area in Texas today where the families were held. The White House press secretary linked the deaths to the need for immigration reform.
It's one of the reasons that the president wants to fix our broken immigration system. It's a treacherous journey, and we don't want to see people go that route. We want people to come through the legal process so that they're not putting their lives on the line to do this.
Trump says instead of heading to Florida with his family, he will remain in Washington through the New Year holiday to deal with the shutdown. So expect more tweets. Ron Charles, CBC News, Washington.
There was resolution to another standoff over migrants today. A boat carrying more than 300 was finally allowed to dock in a Spanish port after a week at sea. The men, women, and children on board were rescued last week in the waters off Libya, but they were turned away by Italy and Malta. The International Organization for Migration says more than 113,000 migrants crossed the Mediterranean to Europe this year. Almost half were initially taken in by Spain, and more than 2,200 died or disappeared during the attempt. Before last month, it was rare for a boatload of migrants to arrive on the shores of Britain. But there's been a recent surge, and today the government declared it a major incident. Dozens of people arrived just this week, making the hazardous crossing from France in small rubber dinghies. Briar Stewart tells us why.
From the southeast coast of England, France lies about 50 kilometers beyond the vast expanse of sea. Today calm, but often turbulent and frigid, and now a route for desperate migrants.
We're talking about the busiest shipping lane in the world. It's winter, although the weather looks quite calm at the moment. That could change at any moment, and it's an extremely dangerous journey.
Bridget Chapman is with an organization that works with refugees. She says since November, there's been a surge in people making the perilous crossing. This week alone, there were more than 70.
This is one of the places where the migrants came. Early yesterday morning, 9 people, including 3 children, were met here by local police and the UK Border Force. They made the trip in a 4-meter-long inflatable raft.
Officials believe the crossings are motivated by increased security around the French port of Calais. It's become increasingly difficult to stow away on a train or truck, so migrants, mostly from Iran, are turning to smugglers to take them across the water.
So the danger is this is going to continue to fuel the flames, if you like, of illegal entry.
Tony Smith is the former head of the UK Border Force. He says the government needs to step up patrols and work more closely with French authorities.
I think we need a joint task force with the French to stop this and put the smugglers out of business, because it's not something that Border Force can manage on their own.
Currently, only 1 British patrol boat is surveying the water along with French vessels.
More patrol boats is part of the answer, but it's also having the resources on the ground we need, working in partnership with the French to identify the gangs, to stop them making the crossings in the first place.
Ultimately, that's not the solution. We need.
Chapman says both England and France need to do better at processing asylum claims so people don't have to risk their lives.
When Alan Kurdi, the Kurdish toddler, was washed up on a beach, People were rightly horrified by that. And we're looking at a situation where we could have something like that happening here.
She fears if people continue to take to the water, it may only be a matter of time. Briar Stewart, CBC News, Folkestone, England.
Okay, turning now to a story that's had a lot of Canadians talking, probably while you're on holidays at the dinner table, and rushing to fill up. Gas prices are sliding. Many cities haven't seen the price at the pumps this low in years. In 5 provinces, gasoline is below $1 a litre, believe it or not. The national average sits at $1.03, and that's the cheapest price recorded in Canada this year after a steady drop since the fall. It's 14 cents lower compared to last year and a stunning 32 cents lower than the peak, which happened back in May. But drivers could be in for a big change in the new year. Olivia Stefanovic on what's driving prices down for now and what Canadians can expect down the road.
It's been a while since a trip to the pumps has been this light on the wallet.
I'm grateful for the lower prices.
I'm super excited, of course.
I can go further and not spend as much money.
How does that make you feel?
A lot happier than earlier this year.
Some of the biggest drops have been seen in Alberta, Nova Scotia, and Ontario. A late Christmas present, perhaps, one that Ontario Premier Doug Ford is taking credit for. He claims his government's removal of the province's cap-and-trade program and opposition to a carbon tax are some of the reasons driving down costs. In a statement, his office says they're saving 4.6 cents per litre, and that's being passed on to consumers. But this expert says that's not the only reason. After all, the trend is being seen across the country.
There's an oversupply of oil globally. So we now have a glut in oil, and that's why consumers are really becoming the benefactors.
Gas prices haven't been this low in the Greater Toronto area for years, but don't expect the savings to last.
It is going to be a volatile year, I would say an extremely volatile year, in which we are going to see peaks and valleys.
The explanation? He says limited oil production around the world and Alberta means prices could go as high as they were in 2014. When it hit a record Canadian average of $1.41. The other factor, the federally imposed carbon tax could cause gas stations to raise prices.
So all of this means that Canadian prices are more likely to go up than go down, but of course we have to be mindful of what's happening globally.
He says prices could plummet amid global trade uncertainty. In the meantime, customers are filling up.
Hopefully you pay off some of this Christmas debt from all the gift giving.
Taking advantage of the extra cash they can save while they still can. Olivia Stefanovic, CBC News, Mississauga, Ontario.
So that should help your weekend a bit. Some of the other developing stories we're following tonight on The National. 3 Vietnamese tourists and a local tour guide have been killed by a roadside bomb near the world-famous pyramids in Egypt. The device was hidden near a wall on a street in Giza and exploded as the bus was passing. The Prime Minister says the bus went off its planned route without telling security forces. 12 other tourists on board were also injured, 2 of them critically. A severe weather system making its way across the U.S. has left at least 2 people dead. The storm dumped about a foot of snow through the Midwest by this morning. Heavy rain is also falling in the southern states with more than 50 people under flood watches. The system is still moving east, and as we head into New Year's weekend, is expected to cause delays at major airports, including New York. And New Brunswick former premier is stepping down as leader of the Liberal Party earlier than expected. Brian Gallant had planned to stay in the role until a leadership convention was held, but he says he changed his mind over the holidays after he was asked if he'll run again.
This is flattering, but it is also problematic, as the Liberal Party needs to move on and select a new leader.
Gallant says he'll resign at the party's next caucus meeting. It's scheduled for mid-February, but could be called sooner now. And after just 6 months in the job, the Humboldt Broncos head coach has been fired. Nathan Oystrick said on Twitter that he had stepped away from the club, adding, "Despite the extreme stress and constant pressure of working with the organization, I gave them everything I possibly could and am proud of their performance and mine this season." Oystrick was hired to replace coach Darcy Hogan, who died in the crash on April 6th. The Humboldt tragedy is also the subject of our reporter's notebook tonight. All week, we have been taking you behind some of the biggest stories of the year, and a little later, Susan Ormiston will reflect on the courage and kindness of the people she met in that community. And our panel of insiders grades the year in U.S. politics, what a year it was, the good, the bad, and who to watch in 2019. But next, flu season is here. Some of you already know that. It appears to be a nasty one, especially for kids.
We don't know exactly why it's touching children more, but we know it is.
Flu season has struck with a vengeance, but it's not just a number of cases that doctors are concerned about, it's the intensity and the young people being affected. The government's own Flu Watch report revealed some startling numbers on infections earlier this month, with more than 8,000 flu cases confirmed by mid-December, a sharp increase from the same time period last year. And of this year's cases, 10% required hospitalization. That's 864 people, more than 280 of them children 16 or under. At this time last year, only 26 kids had been hospitalized. So why is it such a rough flu season for kids this year, and what do parents need to know? We sent our Jayla Bernstein to find out.
It's the last place families want to be over the holidays, stuck in a hospital with a sick kid. One of the downsides to relatives coming together at this time of year is that it creates the perfect conditions for spreading viruses. This doctor says what she finds striking this year is the number of kids who've caught the flu.
What we see is that there is more cases of influenza admitted in pediatrics than what we usually expect. So if we compare it to the average of the past 5 years, we are above that average.
She says that's because children are more susceptible to the strain of influenza that's circulating right now. The last couple of years, H3N2 was more common. It tends to affect the elderly, but this year, H1N1 is back.
It seems that in terms of the immaturity of their respiratory tract, that particular strain of influenza seems to be able to multiply more in a child than in an adult.
Something else that has doctors concerned, kids who already have the flu are more at risk for other serious illnesses like pneumonia. That mix of seasonal bugs is keeping hospitals busy.
Hi, what's your name?
At Sick Kids in Toronto, patient volume is about 15% higher than this time last year. This pharmacist says the best way to avoid all of this is to just get vaccinated.
You may not know that you're standing kind of in line at the grocery store behind someone who's maybe on chemotherapy or whose immune system is compromised, who might get really sick and potentially have a fatal illness from getting the flu.
Even though we're well into flu season, pharmacists still strongly recommend getting the shot. Jayla Bernstein, CBC News, Montreal.
For a bit more insight into this flu season and what you can do to help prevent your kids from getting sick and yourself too, I'm joined by Dr. Julie Johnstone. She's a doctor at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto. Good to see you, doctor. So what can you do beyond the flu shot to try and stay healthy at this time of year?
Yeah, so the flu shot will do part of it, but it won't do all of it. So the things that you can do to keep yourself healthy are the things that you can do against any virus. We would recommend lots of hand washing. So anytime you're around somebody who has the flu or another virus, make sure that you're washing your hands. If you're out in public, the viruses can live in the areas around where we touch, so wash your hands. If you're coughing or sneezing, to please cough into a tissue and then put that tissue in the garbage. Wash your hands after you're blowing your kids' noses. Those types of things will help protect you from getting the flu on top of the flu shot.
Okay, and when should you worry that the flu becomes something more serious and potentially even deadly?
Yeah, so the flu can be dangerous. The flu we know causes pneumonia, causes bronchiolitis, croup, which are respiratory illnesses, and younger kids can cause them to have GI symptoms. So anytime that you see somebody who's getting more sick or unwell from the flu, then you can go and see your physician to have them see your child or yourself to see whether there's any more treatment that needs to be given.
What do you say to parents who say, listen, I didn't get the shot last year, I was fine, so I'll just skip it this year too?
To those parents, usually we would say, just because you didn't get it before doesn't mean you can't get it now. The flu is ever present around us. So the flu vaccine helps protect us from getting the flu, whether we've had it before or not. And every year we need to get the flu vaccine again because the strains change slightly. and the flu vaccine changes to reflect the changes in the strains that might be affecting kids and adults. So we need to re-get the flu shot every year to protect ourselves and our loved ones from the flu.
Okay, Dr. Johnstone, thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Still ahead on The National, Edmonton's public art is harboring a barbarian. No, really, you just have to look very closely. We'll explain in our moment of the day. But first, take a deep breath. Our panel is diving into the rough seas of the year in U.S. politics.
It's been about a month since the midterm elections.
Feels like a lifetime.
Things have been intense.
The White House is gearing up for major confrontation.
And America is divided.
There was so much to talk about. "2018 is coming to a close.
It's been a busy year.
A year like no other.
Midterm elections,
the Mueller investigation,
tax cuts, the border.
The lesson of 2018 is that all the prior lessons of politics have been thrown out the window.
2019 is the year when the cops arrive."
I'm Jay Shabria, former senior advisor to Ohio Governor John Kasich and current Republican strategist.
Hi, I'm Patty Solis-Doyle. I'm a Democratic political strategist. I've worked for Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. I've been in politics for 30 years.
I'm David Frum, a writer with The Atlantic and formerly of the Bush White House.
All right, so for better or for worse, 2018 is almost over. I'm guessing you're going to say for better. And I think we're trying to figure out what this year was and what next year will be. So let's start with this one. What was the biggest surprise politically for you in 2018?
Look, I think the biggest surprise for me was the turnout. We had a midterm election where millions and millions of people came out, and it was a presidential level. I did not see that coming going into 2018. I thought people would be interested, but I thought it'd be politics as usual. That was a huge surprise to me.
I agree with that, Jay, but I also, the component of women in the turnout was really what surprised me. Not just women running for office, not just women working on political campaigns, but voters. Women voters were the key to this 2018 midterms. And also, they were so engaged. I mean, we saw reports where women in huge numbers were the ones calling their members of Congress, going out and protesting and marching. And I just think it was the year of the woman, but also in terms of, for instance, the Kavanaugh hearings, and we had the incredible testimony of Christine Blasey Ford and the Me Too movement. It was just all coalesced into November of 2018.
But in a way, didn't the Women's March foretell that?
Well, it did, but I don't think we imagined in January of 2017 what it would actually mean in November of 2018 in terms of more women being elected ever in Congress before. And it was the Women's March, but it was also the buyer's remorse of Hillary losing. You know, we had the opportunity to elect the first woman president, and we came close, but we didn't do it. And so I think we're making up for it now.
For me, the biggest surprise was Donald Trump giving away the store to North Korea, getting nothing in return, and the entire Republican Party pretending that some tremendous victory had occurred. If President Obama had given away military exercises, threatened to, with South Korea, threatened to tear up the treaty, the trade treaties with South Korea, poisoned relations in all kinds of ways with both the South Koreans and Japan, all for a photo op, preliminary to which he said he had fallen in love with the North Korean dictator. I don't think he'd be impeached. I think he'd have been sent to the taxidermist. And yet, if you live inside the Republican world, this is hailed as a great diplomatic achievement for which the United States got nothing.
So one of the things that we lament journalistically every year is that there's so many stories that are underreported that you just, you know, in a rocketed pace news cycle like the one we're in, the things you don't get to. For me, most underreported story in the U.S. politics is sort of the absence of filled positions at the State Department. There's no ambassador in Pakistan, in Egypt, and in Cuba. There's no deputy assistant secretaries of state in a number of places, and I think it has real world consequences. But I'm sure you have a whole bunch of them too, underreported stories.
Well, this is not exactly an underreported story, but it's an underabsorbed story, and that is the huge New York Times report on President Trump's families. Sorry, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I did some mind reading. Tax history. The leading newspaper in the United States, on its front page, accused the President of the United States of criminal tax fraud. And then a follow-up story 2 weeks later in which they did it again using the word fraud 3 times, which is an invitation. If you think we're wrong, sue us for defamation. Now, it's not underreported. The reporting was amazing, but the rest of the world seems to have decided it's too technical or it was too long ago. The Times' data ran out in about 2004, so they don't have information after 2004. Perhaps the president turned over a new leaf and ceased to engage in criminal tax fraud after 50 years of doing it in 2004, but maybe not.
So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to think of a new one here.
Okay.
So Jay, what's yours?
Well, and I also think this is underabsorbed too, and there's a good reason why this is not reported on. It's the way in which the media treats themselves in the United States. They audition for themselves on Twitter. They talk about stories and they're snarky, and they wonder why people have lost faith in that big institution. And I think that's a shame because the media has a critical role to play in American politics. But right now, people just don't believe in it. And it's largely due to the way reporters and the cable news stations treat themselves.
So how do they make that better?
Well, I think they need to look at themselves in the mirror and do some self-reflection in terms of how they're delivering the news,
right,
and actually talk about it too. No reporter should go on Twitter. I think they should just use it for informational purposes and not for opinions. And that's one of the biggest issues they've got.
Well, separating opinion from fact, for sure. But is it a matter of respect in terms of how you communicate with the audience?
Well, communicating with the audience is fine. The way I look at, when I look at reporters on Twitter, everyone is auditioning for the next job or they're trying to impress their colleagues. And that's not the way it should be. It should, in my opinion, the way the news media should be, not the opinion folks. They need to be reporting the stories, and they don't do that anymore. Now it's the opinion and fact get blend into each other.
Okay, fair. Patty?
Well, I think, I don't know if this is an underreported story, but what I find fascinating about what's been going on over the last 2 years, and it speaks to Jay's point, is the normalization of the chaos. It's how we now, not only the media, but as a country, take President Trump's tweets, for instance, the misspellings, the poor grammar, the sometimes just blatant falsehoods of them, and we take it as news and we react to them. The media reacts to them, voters react to them, Twitter reacts to it, and it's just not normal. And it's not, I don't know what the answer is, whether it's we need to ignore it unless there is actual news in it and not cover it. But the flip side to that is he is the president of the United States, and everything that he says that comes out of his Twitter account is technically news.
Well, in terms of what he says and what he does, sometimes what he accomplishes gets lost, it seems. So tangibly, again, for better or for worse, what is something that he has actually, where has he actually affected change?
Well, he's here, one for positive and one for negative. For positive, I think the president has been successful in squeezing Iran harder with sanctions in 2018. That's part of the price. That's one of the motives behind overlooking this terrible murder committed by the Saudis of a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi. But no question, Iran is in a vice, and that is going to lead perhaps to some kind of crisis, maybe ideally some kind of concessions leading to a diplomatic outcome. Another place where he's made a difference, this time very much for ill, is the utter absence of the United States from the negotiations over Brexit. The EU, including Britain, is the largest trading bloc on earth. The United States has a huge interest in a successful outcome to these talks, and the United States government seems to have no point of view. There's no presidential representative. It's not engaged at all. And the president is constantly egging the British on to the hardest possible exit, which is the worst outcome for them, but also, more importantly, from an American point of view, the worst outcome for the United States.
Okay, Patty?
Well, look, I think unemployment is at an all-time low, and that's a very positive thing. And, you know, a lot of economists saying that we're going into a recession in the next year, but for now, the economy is good, and a lot of people are feeling better about it. And some people will argue whether that was Barack Obama's policies during his 8 years, and Trump was just riding a trend. Others will argue, you know, Trump's president, and it's his economy. So I think that's good. And I'm one of the few Democrats who will say, will give Trump credit for that.
You have credit to give to him for a few more things?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Look, people going into 2016, they didn't understand how religious conservatives would say, I support Donald Trump with infidelities and all these other things out there. They did it for one reason, because of the judicial system. He nominates federal judges, and so far he has nominated very conservative judges, and that is going to have a lasting impact for generations. And now with the Senate going more in Republican hands, that's only going to get easier for the next 2 years. It's going to just completely change the face of the judicial system in America for generations to come.
Okay, so let's look ahead to 2019, a little bit of a prediction time coming up here. A lot of the viewers ask questions about your instincts on how the president will fare in the year ahead. It seems to be obsessional on the part of some people. So what's your gut?
Well, Hattie correctly identified the strength of the economy as both a good thing in itself and also a tremendous resource for the president. I think he's running out of that resource. I don't see crisis ahead in 2019, but the financial markets are telling us that the economy is going to soften. The bond market is suggesting they think interest rates are going to be lower in 2020 than they are now. That's a prediction of recession. Why would interest rates be lower? If someone's cut them, why would they cut them? Because the economy is in a slump. So I think there's been a lot of talk about the Trump base. Trump supporters are not all the Trump base, but the Trump base is not made out of granite and marble. It is made out of human beings who react to experiences. Their experiences with this presidency to date have been reasonably good in the ways that matter most. That is about to be less true.
That is survival through the prism of economics, but what about through the prism of the Mueller investigation?
I think that's a very good question. There are so many different investigations going on at the concurrently. You've got Mueller, you've got the Southern District of New York, you have, the new AG in New York is vowed to look into his taxes, going on that New York Times article. The Trump inauguration is being investigated. The Trump transition is being investigated. The Trump campaign is being investigated. And now we have another new level of investigations coming, and that's coming from House Democrats, whether that's going to be looking into how he dealt with Puerto Rico after the hurricane. And, you know, we don't know what's ultimately going to be found, but I do think that given all of these vulnerabilities, Republicans are going to have to, at some point in the next year, ask themselves, do we really want to stick with this horse, given all the vulnerabilities and potential, criminal activity?
As a Republican, are you asking yourself that?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I always do. And I think I've got a lot of problems with the Trump administration. I always have. But what I'll say in regard to this question is this is a political process more than anything else. And Patty and I have talked about this before. It's not necessarily just a legal position that you have to articulate. You have to articulate the politics of it too. Do the Democrats have that spokesperson that can cut through the noise and say, this is the reason you've got to impeach him or you can't support him in 2020? I don't see that person on the horizon. It's not going to be Nancy Pelosi. Is there someone else out there that can do this? I don't know. Maybe it's one of the 20 people that are running for president.
Okay, so speaking of all these people, last question, prediction for 2019. Who do you think will be the most significant or interesting political actor in 2019? You cannot say President Trump, and it doesn't have to be a politician.
Okay, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but Beto O'Rourke, I think, is the person to really watch, because already people are saying, oh, he's the next Barack Obama. And for me, as a political junkie, it's just going to be very interesting to see whether or not he can rise to that mantle of Barack Obama. And we're going to see in the first quarter of 2019 all of these people running for office. And that means they're going to have to go through some tests. Can they raise the money? And can they make an impact in the first early states like Iowa and New Hampshire? We already know Beto O'Rourke can raise the money, and we know he made a huge impact in Texas and nationally, but can he do it in a retail level in Iowa and New Hampshire? So I'm going to be looking at him, and if he can pass those tests, I think we have somebody that Democrats can sort of hold up.
Patty, is he going to run?
He hasn't said so, but he has no reason not to.
Okay, I was just looking for some insider insight there.
I'm going to be watching very closely someone who is not going to be a candidate for president. That is the new governor of California, Gavin Newsom. California is this dynamic powerhouse in the world. It has been utterly shut out of political power for the past 2 years, to the point where the state can have the worst wildfire in its history, and that be a subject of no interest at all to the national government. Suddenly, California is back. The Speaker of the House is a fellow Californian. California is at on a high. Its economy is in great shape. Its finances are improving. And California, which has a different view of the United States from east of the Sierras, I think it's going to make its weight felt after being absent for a long time.
Okay, last word to you, Jay.
Representative Adam Schiff, I think, is going to be very interesting. He's going to be chairman of the Intelligence Committee going into this new Congress, and the way in which he handles himself, he will be a household name by year end, but the way in which he handles himself will tell you if the Democrats are going to be successful or not.
Okay, the three of you, again, thank you very much, and bring on 2019.
Thank you.
Let's hope it's not as exhausting as the last one. Okay, still more to come on The National on this, the last Friday of 2018. But first, in case you missed it, speculation grows daily about who will run against Donald Trump in 2020. Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton 2.0, Angelina Jolie, to which you just replied, wait, what? Here's what she told BBC Radio Today when asked if she'd consider it.
I really don't know. I always say I'll go where I'm needed. I honestly will do whatever I think can really make change.
Well, she already sounds like a politician, and listen to how she speaks about her UN work.
I'm also able to work with governments, and I'm also able to work with militaries. And so I sit in a very interesting place of being able to get a lot done.
Now, in the end, Jolie didn't say one way or the other, but she didn't rule it out. But in today's America, can you really trust someone who so effectively played a Russian spy in the 2010 thriller Salt? Or wait, was she CIA? Oh man, now I gotta go watch that movie again.
You're good.
Oh, we need each other, Father, but we need you more. Would you just speak to each one of these families that hurts, each one of those billets who goes downstairs to a quiet basement? It's one of those families in the community that just want to help but don't know how.
It's been almost 9 months since the small city of Humboldt, Saskatchewan was plunged into grief and despair by a deadly collision on a prairie highway. The Humboldt Broncos team bore the brunt of that crash, and young lives were wiped out in a horrifying incident. Tonight, in her reporter's notebook, senior correspondent Susan Ormiston revisits all those searing emotions.
It was so intimately tragic. 16 people died, 13 people were injured. And if you think about even the immediate families for those people, say 10 each, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people immediately affected. There's a lot of pressure on a reporter and team in this situation because, as you can imagine, it's very difficult to ask people who've lost their sons and daughters to talk to you. And many of them don't want to, and many of them express that firmly. And I always said, I understand. I totally understand. But then there are people like Scott Thomas who needed to talk.
His first goal from his SJHL career.
Scott Thomas is a hockey father. He lost his son Evan, who was 18. He was in a car behind his son's team bus and tried to get through to the accident site and was barred by police that night.
We go running up and they stop us and can't go any further. And you could see it was bad.
And Scott Thomas told me a story I'll never forget. He said that as a boy, Evan had a birthmark on his cheek, a little one. And he used to come home from school sometimes crying because kids, they're mean, they would tease him about having that birthmark. And Scott told his son, don't worry about it. It's part of you. It's what makes you unique. And then he said, I never thought I'd have to identify my child's body looking at that birthmark. And I was so grateful to him to be able to tell us about Evan. And I think it helped the Thomas family at the time. I can only imagine that's why he spoke to my colleague Dan Zakreski and myself. And we found that a lot, that the parents who did want to speak about this needed to talk.
He knows he has
a wealth of support. So
one of the women that we spoke to less than 48 hours after the accident was Michelle Stratsnitsky. And of course, her son Ryan, 18, was paralyzed from the mid-chest down. And she said she'd just been at a conference with the doctor who told her it's unlikely that your son will walk again, certainly won't skate upright again. And she was able to tell us that. And I formed a pretty strong bond with Michelle out there in the cold on the riverbanks of the Saskatchewan River, because I'm a mother of 2 boys, hockey age, late teens, and immediately I could relate to her.
Hi, Ryan.
Hey.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Finally.
2.5 weeks after the Humboldt bus crash, I was able to interview Ryan for the first time, and I'll never forget it. I had this feeling when he came into the room in his wheelchair. I was so grateful and relieved to finally meet this kid I'd heard so much about. Where do you set your goals now?
I just set my goals, like if I have to get into a wheelchair today, you know, I'm gonna sit that longer than I did yesterday.
And then we decided to follow him for the next 5 months, and that was the best part. Ryan convinced me that legs don't define him. They simply
2,
don't.
1, and stop.
On the night of September 12th, the Broncos had their first game on the ice since the tragedy, the new team. And it was a huge packed arena back in Humboldt, and there was a formal memorial going to happen after that game. It was, I would say, one of the most poignant and painful moments. And I watched this one man, and as his son's name was read, he didn't cry, he wouldn't, but his eyes welled up with tears. And, you know, I was very conscious of that time that I did not want to intrude on this private event at all. So I didn't. And the next day, we were in the hotel where we were staying, and I went to have breakfast, and I was sitting in a booth. And that father was in the booth ahead of me, and I said, okay, it's private now, I can go up and approach him. And I did, and introduced myself and said, you don't know me, but I want to tell you, I really hope that in some way you're getting some solace from the memory of your son and how difficult it's been, and just wanted to say hello. And he had a ball cap on, and just looked up at me and he said, thanks. I went back and finished my breakfast, and he got out, left the restaurant, and I got up to leave and went to pay, and the waitress said to me, you don't have to pay. He said, that man you were talking to paid for your breakfast. Still makes me emotional, because I thought how wonderful for him to be that kind. And that was the quality of people that we saw throughout the Humboldt Broncos story. These strong, resolute hockey families who had endured the worst ever imaginable event in their lives. And they got through it, and they're getting through it.
Thanks for that, Susan. As we take a look at 2018's most memorable stories, we're also going behind the lens to hear from those who captured them. This fall, I sat down with former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, and out of that meeting came a really striking image of a political titan in this country.
While we're still mostly thought of as a TV show, we're really not. We're this multi-platform thing, and that thing requires still images. Okay, ready for the clap? Here we go. I chose a portrait, and it's from an interview that Rosemary Barton did in Ottawa.
Mr. Chrétien, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I put a lot of thought into how I was going to set it up. I tested it out, you know, in the office beforehand, you know, like measure twice, cut once. Literally 2 minutes is all we need. That whole session, for me anyway, I think I had less than 10 frames. It might have been 6 frames with him before he just kind of got bored and was like, okay, are we done? Like, yeah, all right, you know, we got it. You know, look directly to camera, and I lit him in such a way that there'd be no shadows, you know, sort of as a nod to his tell-all book, and I thought I would just bring the axis up here a little bit and look down on him a little bit, because I thought it would give him a sense of approachability. You know, he had all these walls up around him as Prime Minister, and now he's taken those walls down so that we can read about his life. The magic of the picture, if there is any magic in it, is, you know, because of him. It's because of the subject. It's just a way to, you know, all the equipment, all of this is just to let the subject's personality, you know, be revealed.
Okay, so across Edmonton, you probably don't know this, but in about 25 places, a half-naked man hides in plain sight. For years, artist Chris Friesen has been sneaking images of Conan the Barbarian into public murals, but now the Edmonton Journal has exposed his secret. We tracked him down in his BC studio to make his moment of discovery our moment of the day, and we started by asking him, obviously, why Conan?
Conan the Barbarian. He was a childhood icon hero. I was always reading the comics and whatnot. So Conan was one of the first characters that I drew all the time. When I started painting professionally and it kind of came back to it, I thought, what would I really want to sneak in here? And it was either Conan or dinosaurs and Smurfs. I've had a pretty good response so far. I actually just told a client who I had done several murals for, and he thought it was quite hilarious, I think, and that went well. And some of my other clients have asked, not about Conan, but they've said, why is there a guy without a shirt in the background? Like, what's that about? But not everyone knew. Now they do. So I guess I might have some conversations in store.
That's amazing, although I would also be in favor of him sneaking a Smurf in there as well. Okay, that's the National for this Friday, the last Friday of 2018, December 28th. Have a good night, everybody.